Billie Lee was supposed to be a symbol of progress. Instead, she became proof that representation alone doesn't mean growth. Billie Lee arrived on Vanderpump Rules with the potential to be a groundbreaking presence, a trans woman entering a cast long defined by toxic heteronormativity and performative feminism. What followed, however, was not the triumph of representation, but the spectacular implosion of it. Billie managed to make every conversation about empowerment feel like a hostage situation, wielding her identity not as context, but as a cudgel. Her tenure was a parade of contradictions, espousing inclusion while peddling the kind of misogyny that the show already had in surplus. Declaring that most vaginas are ugly was a particularly grim milestone, an argument that somehow managed to insult women broadly and trans women specifically. Then came the infamous fat card remark about Katie Maloney, where Billie reduced body shaming to a dietary issue, blithely suggesting that Katie could simply put down the fork. This wasn't empowerment. It was cruelty in feminist clothing. Her crusade over not being invited to Girls' Night In was another moment of self-inflicted martyrdom. Billie claimed exclusion based on transphobia, but the reality was simpler and far less glamorous. She wasn't invited because she wasn't liked. Turning social rejection into a civil rights issue would have been laughable if it weren't so damaging, perpetuating the idea that marginalized identity excuses bad behavior. Billie's fixation on Tom Sandoval added another layer of discomfort. Her gaze lingered on him with an intensity that the cameras wisely refused to soften. The infamous cold plunge scene, complete with Sandoval's labored breathing and Billie's adoring stare, was less reality TV and more softcore horror. The rumors of a fling between them, fueled by her thinly veiled jealousy and his endless self-regard, felt less scandalous than inevitable. Even when she wasn't body-shaming or sermonizing, Billie radiated the air of someone who mistook chaos for charisma. She antagonized women she should have allied with, recoiled at accountability, and performed victimhood with Broadway-level commitment. Her dynamic with Lisa Vanderpump was telling. Lisa, ever the opportunist, recognized in Billie the perfect hybrid of controversy and self-importance. By the time Billie stormed out of the series, eyes wide and self-righteous, the audience was left wondering how something that began as representation could curdle so quickly into resentment. She had the platform, the story, and the sympathy, but squandered it in favor of theatrics and tantrums. In the end, Billie Lee was a case study in squandered potential. She wanted to be a symbol, but symbols require integrity. Instead, she became another Vanderpump archetype, the self-proclaimed victim who turns every slight into spectacle. The tragedy isn't that Billie was unlikable, it's that she could have been unforgettable for the right reasons and chose the wrong ones instead. Think James Kennedy was just a funny drunk? Then you weren't paying attention to the women he destroyed sober. Few figures in Vanderpump Rules history have managed to weaponize charm and chaos quite as efficiently as James Kennedy. The man is a walking contradiction, an abusive, self-pitying egomaniac wrapped in the flimsy veneer of a cheeky DJ. His fans, and more disturbingly, the show's producers, have treated his cruelty as endearing for nearly a decade, as though a British accent and a few jokes somehow cancel out a pattern of misogyny and manipulation. James's behavior has always been indefensible. Alcohol only amplified what was already there, a deep contempt for women and a habit of deflecting blame until someone else becomes the villain. His apologies are transactional, delivered not out of remorse but necessity, each one an audition for continued relevance. The show itself indulged him at every turn, framing his verbal assaults as outbursts and his violence as drama. Even Lisa Vanderpump, ever the matriarch of misplaced sympathy, insisted on showing his family struggles so the audience could see the other side. The only side that revealed was how thoroughly everyone around him has enabled his behavior. His mother's defenses were almost performance art in denial, insisting critics were simply jealous of her son, as though jealousy explains why women recoil from being called sluts and whores on national television. The bar for maternal accountability apparently sits somewhere between blind adoration and PR crisis management. James's victims, Kristen, Rachel, and Allie, were each dismissed in turn, their pain dissected according to their perceived palatability. Kristen was crazy, Rachel was annoying, and only Allie, the conveniently docile newcomer, was treated with any empathy. The message was clear: abuse only counts if the victim fits a marketable mold. Rachel openly described living in fear of setting him off, even risking her job to placate his temper, and yet the public laughed, because by then, James had attached himself to Team Ariana, and misogyny is easily forgiven when it's directed at the right target. Meanwhile, production hid behind its favorite smokescreen: editing. The show downplayed his behavior, repackaged his tirades as shade, and vilified the women who dared to call it what it was. Katie Maloney, for example, became the scapegoat of an entire season for having the audacity to confront Lisa about James's abuse. The narrative twisted her objection into a petty grudge about shorts, when, in truth, it was about holding an abuser accountable. And for her trouble, she was branded as power-hungry while the men and the network closed ranks. The enabling didn't end there. Tom Sandoval and Ariana Madix repeatedly defended James in early seasons, turning a blind eye to his consistent misogyny because he was entertaining. The irony, of course, is that Ariana later became the face of female empowerment on the show, a feminist figurehead born from the ashes of her cheating scandal. Yet her own silence, when James demeaned other women, spoke volumes. James Kennedy's redemption arc is not one of growth, but of endurance, proof that on reality television, likability trumps accountability. He's still booked, still praised, still spinning tracks under the same fluorescent lights where his victims once flinched. And while fans sip cocktails at his "See You Next Tuesday" sets, they're really toasting the franchise's favorite illusion that charisma excuses cruelty and abuse becomes forgivable once it's entertaining enough to film. Sheena Shea didn't become famous despite the affair. She became famous because of it. Every rewatch of Vanderpump Rules inevitably circles back to the origin story no one asked for: Sheena Shea's affair with Eddie Cibrian. It's a relic from a time when she wasn't good as gold, just another waitress at a West Hollywood restaurant, and, apparently, another entry in Eddie's lengthy extracurricular resume. The show's first season leans heavily on this scandal, but history seems to have quietly deleted Shiana's involvement from the record. It's almost as though the world collectively agreed she wasn't relevant enough to remain part of the Leanne Rimes, Brandi Glanville, Eddie Cibrian triangle. And frankly, it's hard to argue. Eddie left his wife, Brandi, for the more famous Leanne Rimes. Shiana? She got a few tearful tabloid interviews and a reality TV contract. Back then, Sheena sold herself as the doe-eyed victim of an older man's deception, a poor, heartbroken girl blindsided by his betrayal. Yet this portrayal conveniently ignored that she was one of many women in Eddie's orbit, and that she eagerly ran to entertainment outlets to narrate her heartbreak for headlines. There was no mystery about who the real celebrity was in that triangle. The tabloids went where the fame was, and Sheena wasn't it. To this day, Sheena seems vaguely bitter that her 2-year relationship with Cibrian never made it into the pop culture canon. But it didn't, because it didn't matter. She was interchangeable, a Tuesday night fling in a long line of them. While Leanne Rimes' career took a public beating over the affair, Sheena tried to spin her 15 minutes into empathy and ended up looking tone-deaf and opportunistic. Her subsequent behavior only cemented that image. Years later, she flaunted her engagement ring in Brandi's face with the tact of someone completely unfamiliar with shame, asking if Brandi was happy for her. This wasn't youthful naivete, it was a pattern. Sheena has always been desperate for validation. From Eddie, from Rob Valletta, from anyone who might make her feel relevant. There's a charitable argument that she was young, manipulated, and outmatched by a married man with money and fame. Perhaps, but there's also a less forgiving truth. Sheena wasn't a victim of Eddie Cibrian. She was a willing participant who mistook attention for affection and publicity for purpose. In the grand scheme of the Eddie Leanne Brandi saga, Sheena was little more than a plot device, one of many women left behind while the media feasted on the main act. She's since tried to rewrite the narrative through podcasts, memoirs, and the endless monologue of Vanderpump Rules. But the cultural record stands. Eddie married Leanne, Brandy got a book deal, and Sheena got a microphone she's never stopped using. Ultimately, her greatest legacy from that affair isn't heartbreak, it's irony. Sheena built a brand out of demanding sympathy for her mistreatment, yet her own career has thrived on other people's scandals. The girl who once cried about being Eddie's secret mistress became the woman who still can't stop reminding everyone that for a brief moment, she almost mattered. Here's the ugly truth about Vanderpump Rules. The show didn't die because of Scandoval. It died 2 seasons before that. By the time Vanderpump Rules stumbled into its 8th and 9th seasons, the show had long since traded its intoxicating chaos for corporate tedium. The wild, narcissistic cocktail of the early years was watered down into something that could best be described as reality television beige. Season 9, in particular, earns the crown for worst of the worst. Tom Sandoval strutted through it with delusions of leading man gravitas, while Brock, whose greatest achievement seems to be reminding viewers why financial literacy matters, was inexplicably positioned as the season's moral compass. Andy Cohen's insistence on selling Brock as a voice of reason remains one of the show's most baffling editorial choices, surpassed only by the fact that Brock appeared to take the assignment seriously. Schwartz continued his run as the human embodiment of damp cardboard, offering no resistance, no backbone, and certainly no entertainment. The absence of Stassi, Kristen, and Jax left a gaping void where confrontation used to thrive. Without them, the remaining cast was forced to reveal that their supposed good guy personas were simply Jax's chaos acting as camouflage. Once he was gone, their true mediocrity was exposed. Season 8 had already been a warning shot, a sloppy, joyless mess that spent far too much time trying to graft a bland new cast onto a decaying foundation. The Dana Max-Brett triangle was less a storyline than an endurance test, stretching 10 episodes into what felt like a seminar on incompatibility. Even Jax's coke-fueled wedding hysteria, grotesque as it was, couldn't salvage the pacing. The show was a Frankenstein's monster of filler scenes and moral fatigue. And yet, somehow, Season 8 still managed to be more watchable than the grim spectacle that followed. By Season 9, the show had no pulse. Gone were the unfiltered egos and self-inflicted scandals that once made Vanderpump Rules feel like anthropology disguised as entertainment. In their place stood Brock, shouting life advice while borrowing everyone else's bank account, and a cast too sanitized to be compelling. If Season 8 was the accident, Season 9 was the slow-motion aftermath. The moment the audience realized the wreck wasn't just survivable, it was terminal. Vanderpump Rules didn't just normalize abuse, it sold it as entertainment. If there's one recurring theme Vanderpump Rules refuses to outgrow, it's the parade of miserable boyfriends and the women who tolerate them. Season after season, the show glorified toxic relationships under the guise of messy fun. The early years, when Tom, and Jax strutted through West Hollywood, behaving like frat boys with bar tabs, are now almost unwatchable. The cruelty, gaslighting, and unchecked misogyny were so blatant that if the show premiered today, it would have been canceled halfway through episode 3. And then there's James Kennedy, Vanderpump's resident DJ and emotional arsonist, who elevated verbal abuse into an art form. The show treated his outbursts like comic relief instead of the red flags they were. Fast forward to Season 8, where the producers seemed determined to outdo themselves by introducing Max and Brett, 2 charisma-free clones with all the predatory behavior of their predecessors and none of the accidental charm. Their treatment of women ranged from dismissive to repulsive, and their entitlement was only eclipsed by their boredom. Season 8, in fact, was an unmitigated disaster. A parade of new faces no one cared about, all blandly attractive in that influencer without influence way. The only thing worse than their lack of personality was the show's insistence that they were somehow irresistible. Shanna Shea's dating chronicles, particularly in seasons 6 through 8, remain a masterclass in secondhand embarrassment. Her obsession with image and validation, her relentless fixation on Rob, and her reality-defying logic, "He didn't kiss anyone because he doesn't kiss me either," were moments that should be studied by anthropologists, not producers. Her losing her smile film phase, her bizarre daughter fantasy with Rob, and her unblinking belief that everyone else was the problem, all proof that delusion is reality TV's most renewable resource. Then there's Vale, the Ivy League-educated soap actress who wandered onto the show as if she'd taken a wrong turn into Sir. She remains one of the most obvious production plants in VPR history, Vale 1.0, if you will, paving the way for Lala Kent's more entertaining but equally self-deluded version. Both were miscast in a show that rewards chaos over composure. Of course, it wasn't all just bad casting. Vanderpump Rules has long struggled with its treatment of women. Whether it was Jax manipulating Brittany into breast implants for him, Schwartz neglecting a pet reptile to death, or the group gleefully tearing apart one of their own, misogyny was practically a supporting character. The show's women often perpetuated this too, constantly micromanaging each other's relationships, weaponizing loyalty, and turning friendship into emotional warfare. Their alliances shifted with the breeze, as did their morality. Even the show's supposed matriarch, Lisa Vanderpump, wasn't immune to hypocrisy. Her willingness to ostracize Kristen while forgiving James for everything short of arson was proof that favoritism is her real business model. Watching her reward abusive men while sidelining women for emotional reactions was peak VPR contradiction. Few moments were as grotesque as Jax and Brittany's engagement, an absurd attempt to rebrand infidelity as redemption. One minute, Brittany's crying to her mother about Jax's cheating. The next, the entire cast is clinking glasses to their love story. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Meanwhile, Katie, Ariana, and Sandoval were the only ones with the decency to question it. And naturally, they were silenced. Then came Ariana's vagina storyline, an oddly hollow attempt at vulnerability that the show never followed through on. The narrative promised introspection, but delivered avoidance, a metaphor really for the entire series. And for those who thought animal neglect wouldn't make it onto a Bravo show, enter Schwartz and the bearded dragon debacle. A creature's suffering played for laughs, capped off with a mock funeral. It wasn't just distasteful, it was cruel. Some of the show's darkest moments go beyond simple bad behavior. When Ariana's brother exhibited predatory behavior, the cast's response was victim-blaming dressed up as staying out of drama. The women who raised legitimate safety concerns were vilified for gossiping. It was a bleak reminder that even in 4K, patriarchy edits its own footage. Elsewhere, Lala's attempts to normalize her relationship with Rand through luxury optics and NDAs felt like PR spin masquerading as empowerment. The less said about her blasant and Chet Hanks-style affectations, the better. By the time Vanderpump Rules limped into its later seasons, watching the men feign maturity while behaving like bloated, middle-aged versions of their 25-year-old selves became more depressing than entertaining. Sandoval's downfall merely confirmed what had been obvious all along. The show's heroes were always villains. They just had better lighting in the early years. And finally, the show's insistence on exploiting rumors about people's sexuality, Jax's roommate, James and Logan, Brittany and Kristen, wasn't just tasteless, it was dangerous. Outing and speculation aren't storylines, they're violations. In the end, Vanderpump Rules' most consistent narrative isn't love, friendship, or ambition. It's the normalization of cruelty, especially when the abuser has good hair and a confession booth. Watching it now, one wonders how so many grown adults could act like children and still expect applause. But that, perhaps, is the truest legacy of the show. A cautionary tale about what happens when immaturity becomes content. Everyone says Jax was the worst man on Vanderpump Rules. But what if the real villain was hiding in plain sight the whole time? Somehow, Tom Sandoval escaped early scrutiny. In Season 4, while Jax was busy being the show's cartoon villain, Sandoval was quietly perfecting the art of the insufferable man-child, preening, performative, and perpetually self-impressed. The collective blindness toward his behavior in those early years is baffling. He wasn't charming, He wasn't funny. He wasn't kind. What he was, from episode 1, was a smug, petty narcissist incapable of sincerity or self-awareness. His interactions with women, in particular, were laced with condescension, mockery, and a barely disguised disdain. Yet somehow, audiences treated him like a misunderstood philosopher in too tight pants. By the season 4 reunion, his venom toward Kristen had reached the level of parody, sneering, eye-rolling, and smirking every time she opened her mouth, as though his moral superiority were self-evident. It was less mature closure and more middle-school theater kid nursing a grudge. Shayna, in a rare moment of clarity, called him out at the time, and the fact that no one followed her lead remains one of the show's great missed opportunities. Part of the reason Sandoval coasted unscathed may have been Jax. Jax was so spectacularly bad, a compulsive liar, serial cheater, and walking cautionary tale, that he functioned as Sandoval's human shield. When a man like Jax is setting the moral floor, even mediocrity starts to look virtuous. Sandoval benefited immensely from this contrast, slipping through the cracks because he was less awful, which apparently passed for good in the Vanderpump Rules ecosystem. The revisionist history among fans only deepens the absurdity. Scrolling through old discussions from later seasons, one finds people praising Sandoval as some underdog champion while vilifying Katie and excusing the men's appalling behavior. It's a masterclass in selective empathy, a willingness to applaud grandstanding disguised as passion while ignoring cruelty dressed as charisma. And then there's Brittany. Her Season 6 arc remains one of reality TV's most excruciating exercises in self-delusion. Watching her throw Jax a housewarming party mere weeks after his latest act of betrayal was less romantic resilience and more career preservation. The woman endured public humiliation with a smile, not out of love, but out of a desperate fear of losing her screen time. Even Lisa Vanderpump, patron saint of male apologists, was visibly tired of the act. Brittany's problem was never ignorance. It was strategy disguised as devotion. She chose the visibility Jax provided over dignity, convincing herself she needed him to stay relevant. Ironically, she likely would have survived just fine without him. She was popular, connected, and perfectly castable on her own. But Jax's manipulation, bolstered by his delusion that it was his show, ensured she stayed tethered to his chaos. By the time she escaped, she had internalized the show's most corrosive message, that female endurance of male misconduct is somehow a badge of honor. Of course, this isn't unique to Brittany. Every woman on Vanderpump Rules has, at some point, publicly bartered self-respect for a storyline. Stassi endured Jax's cruelty and Patrick's condescension. Katie tolerated Schwartz's apathy as if emotional neglect were part of the vows. Lala submitted to Randall's power games. Ariana rationalized Sandoval's idiocy for nearly a decade. Kristen turned humiliation into a recurring plot device. Even the newer generation, Raquel and Allie, seemed doomed to repeat the pattern. The show, for all its glamour and drama, functions as a case study in how women are conditioned to believe that suffering through a toxic man is a form of loyalty. Yet Brittany's version of that conditioning came with an extra dose of hypocrisy. Her traditional upbringing, one draped in conservative Southern values, managed to produce a woman who preaches faith and fidelity while defending a man who couldn't spell either. Her mother, incidentally, has been married 4 times, which somewhat undermines the stand by your man doctrine. The conservatism, it seems, was reserved for policing others' lives, not living by example. In the end, Sandoval and Jax represent opposite ends of the same rotten spectrum, the loud narcissist and the dumb narcissist, both coddled by a culture that mistakes endurance for virtue. The tragedy isn't that these men behave badly, it's that the women around them are taught to call it love, and the audience once applauded it as entertainment. Never believe it when a Vanderpump Rules cast member says they've grown up. The evidence says otherwise. Somewhere in the tangled archive of Vanderpump Rules, Kristen Dute apparently delivers a memorable "You're 29, grow up" line, a statement so sharp and so quintessentially Kristen that it's become an urban legend within the fandom. The trouble is, no one can quite agree when or to whom she said it. Was it Season 1 during the Laura League staff meeting? The Season 1 reunion, perhaps, where Kristen's moral superiority was at its most performative? Or was it later, during Stassi's 29th birthday fiasco, when Stassi stormed off in a tantrum that could only be described as aggressively adolescent? The collective memory of this quote has blurred into one of those Mandela effect moments of Bravo. Everyone's certain they heard it, yet no one can prove it. But while the hunt for that soundbite continues, another familiar topic emerged from the same conversation: Shiana Shea's perpetual exhaustion, emotional, mental, and allegedly medical. The episode in question featured her egg retrieval procedure, which she managed to turn into an operatic tragedy of martyrdom and self-pity. Tears, camera-ready vulnerability, and a long list of grievances over who did or didn't text her. Classic Sheena. Of course, in proper Pump Rules fashion, the audience split in two. One camp rolled its eyes at what they saw as yet another performance of "Poor me, please validate me" theater. The other camp, armed with first-hand IVF experience, descended like medical fact-checkers, ready to defend both the procedure's legitimacy and Shiana's pain tolerance. They reminded everyone that egg retrieval isn't a casual spa day. It involves hormone injections, bloating, anesthesia, and occasionally actual suffering. The message? Criticize her personality all you like, but this particular storyline doesn't qualify as fair game. Still, the defense of Shayna's fragility misses one key point. She never does anything quietly. The issue isn't that she experienced discomfort. It's that she broadcast every twinge like a live-streamed public service announcement on empathy. Her distress wasn't simply physical, it was cinematic. Viewers weren't watching a woman endure a medical procedure. They were watching a woman audition for sainthood through tears and a ring light. The irony, of course, is that this debate, half detective work about a throwaway quote, half ethical tribunal over egg retrieval dramatics, perfectly encapsulates the Vanderpump Rules ecosystem. A show built on moral relativism, performative suffering, and the inability of any cast member to suffer in silence. Kristen scolding someone to grow up and Shiana sobbing over her ovaries are, in their own way, two sides of the same coin, both desperate performances of adulthood in a cast that's perpetually stuck at emotional age 23. In short, whether it's Dute's phantom lecture or Shiana's overproduced medical martyrdom, Vanderpump Rules continues to deliver its signature cocktail, equal parts delusion, defensiveness, and melodrama served with a splash of self-importance. Some shows evolve. This one just perfects the art of the televised tantrum.